In our last episode, we witnessed the raid on Castle Siege. We followed the investigation, over 300 witnesses, a kingdom's worth of testimony, and a political storm swirling around a woman too powerful and too connected to simply be destroyed. Her accomplices were executed in the most brutal manner the courts could devise. But Elizabeth herself remained. Today, we bring this story to its end. The confinement, the silence, the last night, and the question that remains unanswered to this day. After the trials of her accomplices in January 1611, the question of what to do with Elizabeth Báthory herself caused enormous conflict between the most powerful men in Hungary. King Matthias II was clear about what he wanted. He wanted Elizabeth tried, he wanted her condemned, he wanted her dead. In a letter dated the 14th of January 1611, King Matthias wrote to Thurzo in terms that left no room for ambiguity. He described Elizabeth Báthory as a woman who had put behind any reverence for God and man. Driven by animal crudity and diabolical influence, he spoke of more than 300 innocent virgins and women killed. He described mutilated bodies, flesh burned and roasted. He called her crimes atrocities that the heavens themselves could barely contain. He instructed Thurzo, urgently, directly, to summon Elizabeth before the court, to allow no delay, and to ensure that judgment was carried out according to the law. Thurzo did not comply, not because he doubted the crimes, but because he was navigating a political landscape as dangerous as anything Elizabeth had ever created. The Bathory family was still powerful. Elizabeth's son Paul and her sons-in-law were watching every step of the proceedings. They were not fighting to save Elizabeth. They were fighting to save the family name, to save the estates, to prevent the crown from seizing everything. Paul Nadezhdy, Elizabeth's own son, wrote to Thurzo in February 1611. He acknowledged his mother's guilt. He acknowledged that her punishment was deserved. But he begged Thurzo not to pursue a public trial that would bring eternal shame to his family. He wrote, "The present punishment of my poor mother is worse than death." And Thurzo agreed with him. A public execution would create a spectacle. It would expose the full horror to the courts of Europe. It would humiliate one of Hungary's most ancient noble families in a way from which they might never recover. Thurzo chose a different sentence. On the 25th of January 1611, Thurzo wrote to King Matthias with his decision. Elizabeth Báthory would not be executed. She would be confined. Thurzo wrote that she had been captured and confined to her castle. He later wrote that Bathory was locked in a bricked room within Castle Siege. A bricked room, not a prison cell with bars and a door. A room with its windows and doorways sealed with stone and mortar. A room from which there was no exit, no light, no future. Food was to be passed through a small slot in the wall. It was a living burial. In the folklore and legends that grew up around this story over the following centuries, the image of Elizabeth Báthory walled into a single dark room, slowly going mad, slowly dying, alone with the weight of everything she had done, became one of the most powerful symbols of dark justice in European history. And yet, when priests visited Elizabeth in July of 1614, just weeks before her death, their records suggest something different. Documents from that visit indicate that she was able to move around within the castle, that her confinement was more akin to strict house arrest than a sealed tomb. The truth of her confinement, like so much else in this story, is caught between legend and documentation, between what people wanted to believe happened to her, and what the surviving records actually show. From January 1611 to August 1614, 3.5 years, Elizabeth Báthory lived inside Castle Siege under confinement. She had arrived at that castle as a young bride, receiving it as a wedding gift from a husband who went off to war. She had governed it, managed it, filled it with servants and secrets. And now she died inside it. She had written her will in September of 1610, before her arrest, leaving all of her possessions to her children. By the end of 1610, she had already distributed her estates and lands among Paul, Anna, Orsalia, and Catalin. She had seen the walls closing in. Perhaps she had tried to protect what remained of her legacy. In confinement, she had no court, no servants in the old sense. No power over anyone. The woman who had spent decades wielding absolute control over the lives of hundreds of girls, choosing who suffered and how, was now the one with no choices. No control, no escape, whether that confinement was a torment or a relief. Whether she spent those years in guilt or in defiance, we cannot know. She left no diary, no letters from those years have survived. After that, silence. On the evening of the 20th of August, 1614, Elizabeth Báthory complained to her bodyguard that her hands were cold. She was 54 years old. 3.5 years of confinement had taken their toll. But she was still Elizabeth Báthory. Still the woman who had outlasted every attempt to destroy her. Her bodyguard looked at her and said, "It is nothing, mistress. Just go lie down." She went to her room. She lay down. She closed her eyes. When morning came, she did not open them. Elizabeth Báthory, Countess of Ext, widow of the great commander Ferenc Nadezhdy, the Blood Countess of Székely, was found dead in her sleep. On the morning of the 21st of August, 1614, she was 54 years old. She had lived longer than most of the girls she killed. She had outlasted her husband, her accomplices, and the political machinations of everyone who had tried to bring her down. She died not on a pyre, not on a scaffold, not in the dark of a bricked cell, but in her sleep, in a castle that had once been hers. What happened to Elizabeth Báthory's body is, fittingly, one of the final mysteries of this story. She was initially buried in the church of Székely on the 25th of November, 1614, 3 months after her death, but the villagers of Székely, the people who had lived in the shadow of her castle for decades, who had whispered her name with terror for years, who had lost daughters and sisters and cousins to whatever happened behind those walls. They would not have it. They objected, loudly, furiously. The idea of having Elizabeth Báthory buried in their church, in their community, in ground they considered sacred, was more than they could bear. According to some sources, her body was subsequently moved, taken to her birthplace, to Ext, and interred in the Bathory family crypt, but the location of her body today is unknown. The church at Székely bears no marking of her grave. The castle ruins carry no memorial. Elizabeth Báthory, one of the most documented, most infamous, most discussed figures in the history of European crime, does not have a verified grave. She disappeared into the earth as silently as so many of her victims disappeared into the walls of her castle. What do we do with a story like Elizabeth Báthory's? She has been claimed by folklore, the vampire legend, the bloodbaths, the immortality obsession. She has been claimed by pop culture, appearing in films, television shows, novels, comic books, and songs. She has also been claimed by conspiracy, by scholars who argue she was framed, that her wealth and her family's political influence made her a target. The truth, as is so often the case with stories this old and this dark, lives somewhere in the middle. Something happened in those castles. Girls died, women were tortured. The testimonies of people who saw the wounds, who found the bodies, who begged for daughters that never came home. Those testimonies are too consistent, too numerous, too painfully specific to be entirely fabricated. But the full truth will never be completely known. What we are left with is a story of power unchecked, of a world in which certain people, by virtue of birth and title, could operate outside the boundaries of law and conscience for decades before anyone dared to intervene. It is a story about what happens when those with power are never made to answer for what they do to those without it. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson of Elizabeth Báthory. Not the blood, not the legend, not the vampire story, but this: power, without accountability, produces monsters. This has been the Elizabeth Báthory series on Story Hour USA. 5 episodes, 400 years of history. One of the darkest stories ever documented in the annals of European crime. If this series has gripped you, if it has made you think, made you question, made you want to know more, then there is something you can do right now. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you think. Was Elizabeth Báthory truly the monster history has made her? Or was she, at least in part, a victim of the most powerful forces of her time? Share this series with someone who loves dark history. Someone who is not afraid of the truth, even when the truth is hard to look at. And remember, the most terrifying stories are not the ones that are made up. They are the ones that actually happened. We will see you next time.